in this episode.
rather than implying that a kind of a truth, if you will, that is historical, that's specific to a location, a time, that could be true in one place, but not really true in another. Badiou's model of truth is really much more based on mathematics. The idea of a mathematical truth, if you will, is something that is not relative in any way. It is eternal. The truths that Euclid articulated are still true today, even if they don't explain as much of the world as we now know there is, if you will, right? Nevertheless, they have an absolute truth to them. And his methods of understanding how to reach a truth are absolute. They're not simply, we can say, that was ancient Greece, and now we have different ideas. Well, yes, we have new ideas, we have other ideas, but that didn't make them any less universal. There was nothing specific to one place or time about that kind of a truth. And so mathematical truths really become more paradigmatic than other types of truths, if you will, or knowledge, which is the opposition that Badiou will finally make. The truths have to be distinguished from knowledge. A truth isn't something that we simply understand as something we know and we know for sure that has a kind of a certainty and an establishedness to it. A truth is something that we produce, that we bring into the world, that, if you will, is the underlying truth of a world. And this gets back to the question of the universal, because it's generic to the world. It's part of a generic, something which is not specific to any particular part, but is ubiquitous, is part of the whole, is indiscriminately distributed among across a world, right? So a truth is something that is, on the one hand, immanent to a world and reveals something about the world, the contradictions that inform that world. And by revealing it, it's a way to bring something new into the world, something which is not coming from outside, but precisely from that internal, unseen, but everywhere present contradiction or singularities or indiscernibility, something that doesn't register to the general encyclopedias of knowledge, the general consensus about what counts and what really is there. And that's something that is a kind of a universalism that says that it's not specific, again, to a time or a place, right? It's there to be found and to be brought out as something that we've never seen before, right? So truth will surprise us. And it's not aimed at anybody in particular. It's aimed universally. So you can't have a truth that is somehow only about certain people, only counts in certain limited ways, or only some people think of as true. There has to be something truly universal about a truth.
Hey everyone, welcome to this conversation on the philosophy of Alain Badiou with the Badiou scholar Kenneth Reinhard. I've had in mind for at least a year and a half now to do an episode dedicated just to Alain Badiou, and I was really fortunate to come across a lecture that Professor Reinhard gave on the fundamental philosophy of Alain Badiou, I believe at UCLA. And the moment I listened to the lecture, I had no doubt that he is the scholar to speak to, as he beautifully articulates some of the fundamental tenets of Badiouian philosophy. To be frank, I wouldn't say I've carefully and punctiliously worked through the texts of Alain Badiou. He's one of those thinkers that's just got a vast array of work from mathematics to politics to ontology to, of course, Platonism. But I really was hoping that I'd be well prepared for this conversation, so I read some of the work Professor Reinhardt has written on Badiou, including, in fact, his preface to Volume 3 of Being an Event, Immanence of Truths. And I feel like we did a pretty good job. We covered a lot. We covered the truth conditions, the role of philosophy, the place of mathematics in Badiou's thinking, and what kind of Platonist he is, and his reading of Plato. And also, of course, I mean, as I told him, there's no way that I'll not talk about love when speaking to a Badouian. We spoke of love. My hope really is for this episode to be a prelude to Badiou's thinking, and hopefully be an impetus for you to go and read his works, including his big, Being an Event trilogy. I would just add this. A lot from this conversation stood out to me, but one point Professor Reinhard made, which really spoke to me deeply, was that maybe this is a caricature of Lacan. I'm not saying this is the case, but this is a notion because of the focus on negativity and lack in Lacan's theory of the subject. Sometimes one could perhaps view Lacanian theory in a cynical way. And here's where I think I find I'm deeply attracted to Badiou as a thinker, because, to be honest, his philosophy is quite seductive. It seduces you into thinking about being, about subjectivity in a lot more positive way, in a lot more productive way, in a more creative way. And frankly, to put it plainly, as Professor Reinhard put it, it makes you happier to do philosophy, for lack of a better term. And I think there's something there. As much as I deeply appreciate and almost revere Lacanian theory, I still think at the end of the day, what I'm interested in is philosophy, not psychoanalysis. And Badiou, for me, is one of those philosophers that's really up there as a thinker of metaphysics and ontology. But then, having said that, Badiou, of course, perhaps even famously, retains the subject in his philosophy, unlike some of his contemporaries in the French theory scene. And I think also, I know this for a fact, Badiou also seriously takes Lacan's work into consideration and even claims that for you to do any kind of philosophy, any worthwhile philosophy, you need to first go through Lacan. And I think there's something there too. Of course, though, to reiterate, this was only an introductory episode to Badouian philosophy and all the minutiae of how the Libliana school reads Lacan or how Badiou reads Lacan. That's for another day. But as I said, I'm super grateful for Professor Reinhard being generous with his time and knowledge. And with that being said, a quick PSA. As you may know, I've mentioned multiple times, I'll never have advertisers or sponsors on this podcast. Frankly, I think we live in a society of excess and overconsumption, and I don't want to contribute to that by selling you more things. That being said, though, forgive me for the tautology. We, for better or worse, live in the world we live in. I run this podcast on top of doing a full-time job while doing my master's, and if I'm to sustain this project, I need some kind of financial backing. So if you have the means, please do consider financially supporting this podcast through Patreon, Substack, or PayPal. All the links will be in the show notes. And if you're wondering, what are the perks? What are you going to get? The honest answer is nothing. That's right. There's no exclusive behind the paywall perks. You're simply supporting this project if you think the already free content that's publicly available is of any value to you. I sincerely do want to thank the existing supporters on Patreon, Substack, and even PayPal. However, if you're considering supporting the project, please do so only if you have the means. Alright, back to the episode. Professor Kenneth Reinhard is Research Professor of Comparative Literature and English at UCLA, where he directed the Center for Jewish Studies and founded the graduate program in Experimental Critical Theory. He has written on psychoanalysis, philosophy, religion, and occasionally literature and opera. He is the co-author of The Neighbor, 3 Inquiries into Political Theology with Slavoj Žižek and Eric Santner, and After Oedipus, Shakespeare in Psychoanalysis with Julia Reinhard Lipton. He is the editor and co-translator of Columbia University Press series of the complete seminars of Alain Badiou, and he has translated several of Badiou's books, including the culmination of his Being an Event trilogy, The Immanence of Truths. With that being said, here's a conversation on the philosophy of Alain Badiou with Professor Kenneth Reinhard. How's it been being a translator? I mean, you've translated a lot of work by Badiou. I'm curious what that project entails. And yeah, it's quite a feat, at least in my eyes. But if you could just tell us what that looks, on a day-to-day basis.
Well, it's been a wonderful experience, I have to say, really a life-changing experience. And it's one that I've had in partnership with Susan Spitzer. I'm really, if you will, the junior member in our translation team. She is by far the better speaker and reader of French, and she's a professional translator. And my expertise is more on the side of philosophy and the conceptual questions. But it's a great partnership. We work very closely. We send drafts back and forth. We're very, very much perfectionists. We don't let things go until we are really happy with them. We have at points worked closely with Badiou when there were issues that seemed to really require his comments. But in general, he tells us, you should decide what you know my work, whatever you think is right is right. But it's been a wonderful experience, and it's really why I retired from teaching at UCLA is to pursue this full time.
Yeah, excellent. In fact, I mean, I'll be mentioning this in the introduction, but the reason I started with that question was for the listener. I mean, you've really translated his one of his biggest works, Immanence of Truths, and
Yeah.
I think you said you're working on his 900-page seminar for today, Plato, which is
Yes.
I certainly am keen to read if I can find the time and energy. But so yeah, that's
It's quite a fun read, I have to tell you. The
I can
seminars
imagine.
of Badiou are astonishing. Like in the case with Lacan, the seminars are very much more readable, open, generous, and so this is the big project is to translate all of Badiou's seminars. We have a contract with Columbia University Press to do that, and we've had some help along the way. Some other scholars have translated individual volumes, but Susan and I are really in charge of the whole project, and we'll be translating most of the remaining seminars.
Excellent. Yeah, in fact, I mean, you're really the first who I'd consider Badiou scholar that I'm talking to on the podcast. However, I've spoken to many thinkers who've been deeply influenced by Badiou's work. Let's call them Badiou aficionados, and they all told me if you want to get him, yes, read his, let's call it magnum opus, but go and read his seminars if it's
Yeah.
translated, because there's something really there, kind of like Lacan. I mean, I think now it's changing, but if I'm not mistaken, people made the mistake with Lacan. They pick up a Cree, uh, and they're like, "What's this all about?" And but then you got to start with the seminars. Excellent, Professor. Oh, okay, so as I was mentioning before we started recording, just to start on a bit of a personal note, I'm interested for you personally here. Yeah, what drew you towards Badiou's philosophy? Not just to the point of just being, yeah, like a let's say a connoisseur, but rather, putting in all this work to translate his seminars and really become a Badiouian scholar. If you could just tell us a bit about that.
Sure. My first knowledge of Badiou at all was through my friend Bruce Fink, who is a translator, a scholar, and practicing psychoanalyst. And Bruce and I became good friends. And I asked Bruce at one point back in 1989, I think, who is the philosopher that you studied with in Paris who was really the most profound? And he had no hesitation in saying Alain Badiou. And so, okay, I had never heard of him, and not many people had in America at that point. And so, another friend brought me his great book, Being an Event, Home from Paris, and I started immersing myself in Badiou. Um, and then, very fortunately, things changed, became much more personal. Besides the kind of intellectual shock and excitement of reading his work, when in 2001, I invited him to speak at a conference I organized at UCLA on St. Paul. Badiou had an important book he wrote on St. Paul, also came from a seminar, and many other contemporary thinkers had been working on St. Paul, Agamben and Žižek, and many other interesting people. So we had a big conference and brought all of them together. And I was just thunderstruck by Badiou in person. I was absolutely, compelled by him. He's an extremely attractive, open, generous person, very, very loving and, good-natured. And it was really quite an experience. And then for many years, every year at least, sometimes more often, Badiou would come to Los Angeles and we would have either a conference that he was involved in, or we would have just him for a series of talks at UCLA and other local universities. And so we became very good friends. And this led finally to our mutual friend, Susan Spitzer, starting to translate his work. And then Susan and I started working on some of the projects together. First of all, the ones that were specifically on Lacan, which was, again, where I was coming from intellectually. And then we expanded and started doing more and more of his work. So it was a very profound kind of conjunction of personal and intellectual, finding somebody who, clearly welcomed Lacan, was responsive to Lacan, saw Lacan as one of his great masters, but was for me ultimately giving me something that Lacan did not give me. He gave me much more sense of, if you will, something positive, something that I could do that would bring something good and true into the world, rather than, this what I take as the somewhat pessimistic philosophy underlying Lacan's thinking, which simply, as psychoanalysis in general, looks to find a better symptom, if you will, a more livable version of neurosis, possibly includes some real transformation, but I think remains on a very subjective level, meaning a very personal level. And Badiou seemed to open something up to me that involved changing the world, not just myself.
That's fascinating. I mean, okay, if I could go out on a limb here and just ask, if you could hone in on that, is this because I'm curious if you could just expand on that point really? Is this because of Badiou's Neoplatonism, or what do you mean by this notion that he gave you something positive beyond what Lacan and psychoanalysis gave you, Professor?
Yeah. First of all, I wouldn't associate him with Neoplatonism. It's just because of the history of that concept. Neoplatonism, for Badiou, is the version of Platonism we associate it with figures like Plotinus, who were leading to the Christianization of Plato,
That's fair.
which for Badiou is an abomination.
Yes.
So I would call him Platonic or possibly Neoplatonic on some level, but I would avoid that particular word. But yes, I mean he is first and foremost a Platonist, a thinker of Plato, someone who agrees with Plato on most things and sees Plato as articulating what is most important in life, as well as what philosophy can offer us in terms of ways of living. And Plato was, you might say, first of all, battling against the sophists. That's a historical fact in his work. He's trying to, if not refute the sophists, at least silence them. He sees the sophists as his real enemies, and the sophists are the ones who believe that everybody has an opinion. All opinions are potentially equally good and relative. And so there's a kind of a relativism, a skepticism, a kind of a disbelief in the universal and absolute possibilities of truth that Plato identifies. And for Badiou, that is crucial, right? How do we restore a notion of truth rather than seeing truth as what Aristotle will come to see it as a kind of an adequate representation of something in the world, right? How do we get back to Plato's idea of truth as something that involves a true life, if you will, a true way of living, bringing something truly new into the world? And that's a radically different account of truth than the one that we've lived with ever since Aristotle, if you will.
Beautiful, beautiful. Yeah, I mean, you probably can see here my lack of philosophical knowledge because it's funny. Like I said, Neoplatonism, but what I really meant was I think Platonism. But in my head,
Yes,
I'm kind of like, oh, Badiou is a Platonist, but he's new, therefore is a Neoplatonist, which is
I
completely.
understand. I
So,
understand.
so I'm
Yeah.
glad you
Uh,
corrected me there. I don't want to promulgate any false thinking. Excellent, Professor. Okay, I think this is a great segue because you mentioned the notion of universalism. And I'm deeply interested in this because I have to admit, before even Badiou, I was drawn towards what you'd call, I think, the Ljubljana school or the Slovenian school. So Alan Kazupanček, Miran Dola, of course, and Slavoj Žižek. And one reason I always appreciated them was because they were, for me at least, from my reading, universalist thinkers, especially with Hegel and whatnot. They are universalists.
yeah.
And then, of course, eventually, like most people, I mean, Badiou is just such a big figure in philosophy. I started reading Badiou. Uh, can you tell us, yes, just again, a very naive question, when either you or Badiou speaks of universalism, what does that entail?
Yeah. Well, first of all, it is a kind of way of criticizing relativisms and if you will, finitisms, the limitations that those things imply, rather than implying that a kind of a truth, if you will, that is historical, that's specific to a location, a time, that could be true in one place, but not really true in another. Badiou's model of truth is really much more based on mathematics. The idea of a mathematical truth, if you will, is something that is not relative in any way. It is eternal. The truths that Euclid articulated are still true today, even if they don't explain as much of the world as we now know there is, if you will, right? Nevertheless, they have an absolute truth to them, and his methods of understanding how to reach a truth are absolute. They're not simply, we can say, that was ancient Greece and now we have different ideas. Well, yes, we have new ideas, we have other ideas, but that didn't make them any less universal. There was nothing specific to one place or time about that kind of a truth. And so mathematical truths really become more paradigmatic than other types of truths, if you will, or knowledge, which is the opposition that Badiou will finally make. The truths have to be distinguished from knowledge. A truth isn't something that we simply understand as something we know and we know for sure that has a kind of a certainty and an establishedness to it. A truth is something that we produce, that we bring into the world, that, if you will, is the underlying truth of a world. And this gets back to the question of the universal, because it's generic to the world. It's part of a generic, something which is not specific to any particular part, but is ubiquitous, is part of the whole, is indiscriminately distributed among, across a world, right? So a truth is something that is, on the one hand, immanent to a world and reveals something about the world, the contradictions that inform that world, and by revealing it, it's a way to bring something new into the world, something which is not coming from outside, but precisely from that internal, unseen, but everywhere present contradiction or singularities or indiscernibility, something that doesn't register to the general encyclopedias of knowledge, the general consensus about what counts and what really is there. And that's something that is a kind of a universalism that says that it's not specific, again, to a time or a place, right? It's there to be found and to be brought out as something that we've never seen before, right? So truth will surprise us. And it's not aimed at anybody in particular. It's aimed universally. So you can't have a truth that is somehow only about certain people, only counts in certain limited ways, or only some people think of as true. There has to be something truly universal about a truth.
Yeah, so you mentioned this term finitism. Would it be the case that finitism involves, I think you write about this in your preface to Imminence of Truths, where it involves like ideology. So if you say ideology, is that a kind of a finite way of thinking, like an ideology of a culture or a nation and so on?
Yeah, I think that's one way of understanding of finitism. Um, Finitisms are ways of seeing situations as closed, as limited, as having a kind of an insularity to them, whether we're talking about the finiteness of the body or the finiteness of, possibilities within a collective or any other the great one, of course, that Heidegger and others will insist on of death, right? All those finitisms, Badiou argues, are really, in a ways, attempt to ward off, attempts to avoid the kind of dizzying experience of the infinite. The infinite is the primary experience that we all have. And actually, mathematics is quite interesting on this notion too, that infinite numbers are much more, if you will, real and interesting and significant than finite numbers. Finite numbers are kind of a small, strange subclass of what's really out there, which is infinite numbers, right? The great hierarchy of the larger cardinals. And what we have done, not only, if you will, in a certain level of mathematics, by thinking of it as enumeration, as counting, right, as determining the number of something, right? But all of these various ideological ways is to avoid thinking the truly infinite, right? The larger infinites that would not allow such reductions if they were allowed to speak for themselves, if you will.
Beautiful, beautiful. Yes. Okay, Professor. I mean, okay, before we get to a bit of his philosophy, I have two, you might call them tangential questions on Badiou the philosopher. I'm curious, so with everything you said, the universalism, the notion of truths being immanent, and the contradictions you spoke of, in terms of, let me see how I can formulate this question. In terms of, let's say, Badiou's philosophical milieu in the French theory scene that he came up in. And how was he situated as a thinker within that milieu?
Mm. It's a good question. It's an important, you know, issue, really. Um, he is not typical of any school or any group. He came up in the kind of usual way that those major philosophers did, going into the École Normale Supérieure, in a class that included many of the other great philosophers of our time. Um, but he was in many ways different from them. His first great master, as somebody who was becoming increasingly involved in philosophy, was Sartre, right? And this led him to, in a sense, break with Sartre at a certain point, or at least shift alliances, as many people did, and see Althusser as the new kind of focal point and a new type of thinking that involves structure and mathematics for many of the people, included psychoanalysis for the first time, right? And there was a real kind of focus for many years on Althusser. But like many people, Althusser was disappointing for Badiou. His response to what happened in '68 in Paris was not what people had hoped for. And there was a real kind of an emergence of the idea that something new had to come. Maoism was clearly an important influence at this point, and Badiou's political activities are another huge topic of conversation because besides a philosopher, he has, for many years, was a very, very active participant in making new politics. But intellectually, what was singular about him at that point was as the kind of post-Althusserian movement was emerging and deconstruction was becoming more and more dominant, Badiou was resistant to a lot of the assumptions of deconstruction. A lot of the people who Badiou was favoring, beginning with Plato, were very much out of favor with most of the major philosophical thinkers at that point. Badiou was defending Plato as a source of really new, exciting, inspiring possibilities where many people like Derrida or Rancière were much more critical of Plato. Plato had been the kicking boy for all of the 20th century of every school you can imagine, right? One thing people agreed on in the 20th century was that Plato was really bad, right? Whether it was because he was a fascist, totalitarian,
Yeah.
whether a Christian, whatever you thought, Plato represented the opposite, but not for Badiou. And so that was a real important point of singularity in his thinking. Similarly, his approach to his relationship with psychoanalysis and Lacan was rather singular in those days. I'm talking about the late 60s, early 70s and on. He was taking Lacan as seriously as the most hardcore Lacanians were. He was not himself a practicing psychoanalyst, nor was he himself in therapy or in analysis. But he saw what Lacan was doing as having real significance for him, for his own thinking, and for really what is happening in the world, not as philosophy, but as what he calls anti-philosophy, which nevertheless all philosophers must learn from, must think their way through in order to further philosophy. So look, the kind of the positivity that he had for Plato, and I should also add Descartes to there too. Descartes became a kind of another kicking boy for French philosophy, the one who seemed to center the subject in ways that were increasingly distasteful, with Althusser already, and with deconstruction even more so. And Badiou insisted on the radicality of Descartes' thinking. He was also a Hegelian in a way that very few of his fellow, let's say, major philosophers of the 70s and 80s in France were. Hegel was he was not a partisan Hegelian in the way he is, if you will, a partisan Platonist. But Hegel he saw as a truly radical, original thinker who had to be dealt with, who he in many ways saw himself as modeling his own career on as a philosopher. So his very strong affinity for those three philosophers and Lacan gave him a singularity. This notion of holding on to truth when truth was in general a sort of a suspect category, was understood as an ideological weapon, and holding on to the subject when the subject too was understood as a kind of a retrograde, kind of essentialized category that we really need to deconstruct and to get away from. So Badiou's originality was in holding fast to those concepts and pushing them forward, developing them in new and exciting ways.
Let me just probably to provoke here, let me just ask you this. Deleuze, how would because you're talking about the subject here and psychoanalysis, how did Badiou and Deleuzean philosophy, how did he view Deleuze here in this case?
Well, it's a fraught relationship. Alain was somewhat younger than Deleuze, and he, wanted to be on good terms with him, but Deleuze was not very interested in what he was doing. And ultimately, as you may know, Badiou has a book on Deleuze, which is quite critical of Deleuze. And finally, Deleuze is something like a parallel figure for Badiou. He is not a Deleuzian, and he disagrees with him vehemently on many points, but he sees him as a fellow traveler, if you will, more someone he has more affinity with than he may have with Derrida or Lyotard or the more, let's say, post-structuralist thinkers that we associate with deconstruction. Deleuze, the one interesting point I might make here is that for Deleuze, philosophy is a kind of a truth-making machine, right? That's what philosophy does. And for Badiou, it's absolutely not the case. Philosophy has no claim to produce truths whatsoever. In fact, philosophy is subordinate to the four areas of life that produce truths, right? Politics, art, science, and love. And philosophy can't exist without those truth procedures in those fields. Philosophy doesn't have the ability to make its own truths. It can adjudicate, it can talk about how these truths can be compossible, can be possible together, if you will, how they work with each other, but it has no productivity of truth itself.
Yes, in fact, Professor, one point I wanted to ask from you was he calls it, I believe, a disaster when philosophy kind of it makes the mistake of becoming a truth procedure. And I think he uses politics, for instance, here, where you have like a philosopher like Heidegger who tries to use his philosophy to become a Nazi, or even in the case of Marxism, there's this notion of where you entangle philosophy with the truth procedure of politics. And I'm curious just to if you could kind of you know riff off that really, why philosophy shouldn't get involved in this notion of truth procedures.
Yeah. Well, first of all, the problem that he sees is one that he calls suturing. There's a tendency of all sorts of philosophers. Let's take Heidegger as a good example, to suture philosophy, meaning making a kind of a exclusive, strong connection to one of the truth procedures. So in the case of Heidegger, it's art or poetry primarily, right? So for Heidegger, truth is something that poetry makes, right? That poetry is a kind of a truth procedure, if you will. But philosophy is fundamentally connected to the poetry truth procedures in exclusion of other possibilities in politics and science. And again, with Heidegger, the anti-science impulse is most notorious, where Heidegger sees science as a kind of a domestication, of a taming of knowledge, giving it claims of truth that it really can't make, as a kind of an ideology even. And technology in particular is the reduction of science to its essence. So there's a kind of a positive and negative suturing of philosophy in Heidegger. And for Badiou, the problem is, it's not that poetry doesn't produce truths. It's precisely poetry that is one of the truth procedures for Badiou. But if we get exclusively fixed on that one, right, if we suture it to that, then we lose the compossibility of all the truth procedures. And without all of the truth procedures, philosophy is, if you will, lame. It's not using all of its possibilities of, it's not able to talk about really why all of those truth procedures in a particular historical moment of time. And it's always philosophy in a moment of time that Badiou is talking about. Why philosophy in a particular moment of time is possible is because it has an awareness of the truth procedures of all four of those fields and doesn't get somehow, attached in a sort of artificial way to one over the others.
Interesting. Um, is this similar to kind of the Hegelian notion of the Isle of Minerva sets forth at the dawn of dusk, the notion that philosophy, in some sense, can only analyze the current condition, and you can't really kind of predict what's to come and whatnot. Is it along those lines, or is Badiou talking about something different?
I think that it's a good connection to make that, in a sense, philosophy, the owl of Minerva, right, only works after something else has happened. And that something else is going to happen, not necessarily as it is for Heidegger in terms of the history of philosophy or the history of religion, the history of culture, right, history of nations, but it's going to happen in terms of, again, these fields of truth procedures in relationship to what he most famously calls an event, right? Some kind of a disturbance in one of those fields that allows for the opening of something new, that allows for that underlying generic possibility to emerge, right? So, yes, it's a kind of a retrospective kind of project that philosophy has, but it's a sort of an immediate retrospection, right? It's in the present moment as it reflects back on the way that those other fields have produced truths, right? Both historically, because this is not simply a presentist kind of notion of the production of truth. Truth procedures always are in relationship to events, and events themselves form something like a history over time. They resonate with each other, if you will, truth procedures in a particular field. Um, so the events that we had in the past continue and are resonating with events that happen afterwards in politics or in art, right? So we can't simply talk about the French Revolution as an event without having some sense of its relationship to Spartacus, right, and the slave revolts that preceded it. Um, so in that sense, uh, yeah, philosophy has a kind of a reflective quality that could be seen as like the owl of Minerva, right? Secondary, if you will, to those productive fields of truth.
Yes, yes. I mean, here again, speaking of mathematics, he calls George Cantor's the discovery of set theory. That's the he calls it the Cantor event, right? And then how that kind of created something new in that regard. Beautiful. Uh,
Exactly.
yeah.
And that event itself is not simply its own singular event, which it is. It also resonates with the events in mathematics that go back to the ancient Greeks and that will continue later on with all the great thinkers, Paul Cohen and later thinkers who, if you will, constitute their own events.
Yes, yes. Okay, I think I'd like to just to get a better understanding of the notion of an event here. One of my favorite books that I've read, I'd say not by Badiou, but just in my life, I'd say is his book, In Praise of Love. Just a beautiful, beautiful book. And I think that's his most popular book. And, influenced both non-philosophers and philosophers alike. Um, and I've always I like that he kind of talks about the radicality of love in that book and how it doesn't fit into the order of things. So I'm trying to draw the connection between the way he views love, the love event, where it's something radically new, in relation or vis-a-vis, let's say, what you're describing here, where in some sense, like you mentioned, the French Revolution or the discovery of set theory by Georges Cantor, where it still is related to certain historical conditions. So, because my understanding, Professor, was that the event is something that in fact it's truly new in reality in some sense. Like it doesn't fit into the order of things. And I think love here again is the best example, the famous one, him using Romeo and Juliet. by Shakespeare. So how does can you like maybe am I misunderstanding the way he speaks of an event here, or I'm curious just to hear your thoughts on that.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, there is something real singular in every event.
Singular, that's right.
Um, it's completely, it's new. Not to say that it comes from outside, right? That's always important for Badiou. This is not some kind of transcendental thing that comes and descends into our world. It's there, but we never saw it, if you will. It's imminent in our world, and something has to happen to make it appear. And it's not going to appear to everybody, right? Not everybody will agree that an event is an event. For some people, it'll simply be an aberration, a disturbance, or they won't even notice what's happening, right? But for someone who says, no, this was an event, this was truly singular, it has, maybe again, it's a love experience, an encounter that someone says, this is a radical, unthought of thing in my world. I have never experienced it. That's true. And that is the only way that love happens, according to Badiou. Nevertheless, you know, a lover is in a kind of a history of love at the same time, where there have been such events. This is why Badiou will say everybody, loves lovers. Lovers are very attractive because they resonate with us, even if we don't know their experience, even if it's absolutely private. We have had such experiences. We know about experiences like, if you will, Romeo and Juliet's, fictitious experience, or Abelard and Eloise. That's one of his favorite ones too, right? We know that our individual radical upheaval, that is a love encounter, is something that is forms, if you will, a link in a chain with the history of such things. Not to say that those things give it its meaning, right? But nevertheless, every event resonates with the previous events in the field in which it occurs, right? Now, an important point to make in all of this is the love event, just like the science event, the politics event, or the event in any field or in art that we're talking about, it really is almost a vanishing experience. It's something that's evanescent. It comes and it goes. Our relationship with events is always one of after the fact. We may experience it. In love in particular, there's a kind of an immediacy to it. But then the only way that we know that it's real, if you will, that it really is an event, is in terms of what happens next, right? Do we remain faithful to that love event or that event in science and politics and art? Do we develop its implications and consequences, right? Do we see a new world emerge from the unique perspective that love opens up of two, right? That's one of the great things of Badiou's account of love, is that love is really what brings difference into the world. It's not a kind of fusion of two into one. It's really the production of real two-ness. And I'm a firm partisan of Badiou's theory of love. I think on a personal existential level, it simply is the best theory I know. Um,
Undoubtedly, I completely agree. I mean, I think Žižek really developed his own theory of love using Badiou's notions. Just because if you think of like, especially I think, and I'd love for you to speak more on this because I can't have a Badiou scholar on and not ask about love. This idea where in our contemporary culture, where because we're quite narcissistic, people have like he talks about like dating apps and online dating where you try to find someone that you can fulfill all your desires or like tick off all your needs, kind of like you're buying a commodity. Whereas love, being a disjuncture, doesn't fit into any of that. It really is. There's something, as you said, it's a singularity. But yeah, I mean, just if you could speak more, you said it resonates with you existentially. In our current amidst our culture, kind of capitalist society, neoliberalism, whatever you may call it, how does Badiou view love? And let's say, let me rephrase the question. For someone who's not read In Praise of Love, who has no idea all this very abstract metaphysics, speculative philosophy of events, truth, procedures, whatnot, if you could just say what is love for Badiou, how would you do that, Professor?
Well, it's interesting. Badiou did not always see love as a truth procedure. It's something he introduced into his thinking. At first, not to make a big history of this now, but at first, politics was the most important truth procedure. And the subject, which we haven't really talked about, but the concept of a subject was primarily associated with politics, right? But as he developed and his thinking, matured or grew in various ways, it became clear to him that love had to be included as a truth procedure. And it has the very same structure that all the truth procedures do that we've just been talking about, where the condition of possibility of love is an event. There's got to be some kind of an event, just as in science, there's something, if it's, Cantor or, Einstein's theory of relativity, something that changes the very conception of what's possible in a world, right? An event we should think of as, again, something that fits in no categories that are recognizable within a particular world, right? Something that seems incoherent, right? And some basic level, maybe negligible or maybe some kind of a monstrosity, but nothing, that makes any sense in those terms. And a love encounter, just like any other event, is something unexpected, right? Like you say, you can't go on dating apps, you can't go on Love Island and see, and find your perfect match, right? No, it's not a question of something that you're looking for. It's something that shocks you, it surprises you. And that's the first step of love, right? That there's some kind of an encounter with another person. And what really is astonishing about that encounter is that there's something really other in that person, that a kind of an otherness. It's not as simply a question of like, oh, we just seem like, souls who've been looking for each other, or we're so alike, or complementary, or anything like that. There's a radical difference in that other person that really surprises you. It's not like anything you expected to see in another person. All of a sudden, you're like, this is not what I thought it was. This is not who I thought it was, right? And then, there's usually the declaration in the case of love. Someone says, I love you, right? There's almost a formula that's a seal, the kind of a verbal tag that's put on this event. But then the real process is quite exciting, right? A love procedure, love truth procedure involves constructing a new part of a world that is precisely based on difference, based on the fact that you and this other person have a kind of a double vision, a way of looking which is not in sync. But in your adjudication of those differences, you are finding things in the world that you never realized were there that become your own, right? You're creating what Badiou calls a generic set, right? And that's what all truth procedures do. They articulate parts of a world that seem not to have any necessary connection beforehand. But from this new perspective, the perspective of the love event now and the dual vision that it gives you, you can reassemble, make new connections, and create a part of the world that you share, an expanding part, right? That is that is invisible to other people, that doesn't really read beyond your love experience. People envy it, if you will. They see it and they love it. People love love, right? They would like to have it or to find something like that, but it's a perfectly new world. So there's this process of discovery, of creation, of making something new when you're with someone you love, and together you're following a truth procedure. Doesn't mean that it's a kind of a unanimity of a kind of the easy harmony. It can involve struggles. It can involve terrible conflicts, and because that's the nature of difference. Difference does not always look so, favorable. It's not something we always like when we see something different, right? But when we see difference, yet we are experiencing this bond of love, right? It makes us say, well, why is this possible? How is it possible that this other person sees the world in a way that I never thought of before? Does this change the way I see the world too? Can I accommodate this? And as the two people continue to negotiate this new world that they are creating, ideally expanding it, finding more and more novelty in this world, right? They're really entering into their own reality, something that's very special and precious.
Yes, yes, yes. I mean, thank you for that. That was beautiful, Professor. I mean, I'd say like, even if one isn't too keen on philosophy, just what you described, it's just at a very existential, experiential level.
Yeah,
People know what you're talking about. Like it doesn't even require theory in that sense, even though I defend theory at all times, because it's what you put into words right now. Anyone who's fallen in love knows the notion of it being the
yeah,
disjuncture, the difference, the fall, the tombe hemeru, and they know it all. Beautiful. Um,
exactly. And but yet we have so many, let's say, models of love that are dominant, right, culturally, that are quite the opposite of this, right?
yeah,
And that create much unhappiness.
yeah.
So
Yeah, I think the book that I've gifted the most to people in just amongst my friends is Badiou's In Praise of Love, because I mean, I couldn't agree more with you that the fact that what the love event does to one, but also importantly, there's there's a sense of freedom in it, in the fact that you need to freely choose, you need to be responsible in some sense to assume the love event, and then create a new world with this difference. And it does quite, dishearten me. I'm 27 years old, and I all of my life I feel like, from my culture, at least the contemporary culture, before I started reading philosophy, even as like a teenager, the kind of the love I was shown was either this transactional, kind of commodified love, or the pure narcissistic form of love, where you see people, they want to look better, they want to, I don't know, look prettier or speak better, and there are all these like pickup artists and all these things we see where they make it like some kind of algorithmic game or like a strategy. And it saddens me that this is kind of the way that our culture views love. I'm not, again, not to be nostalgic for the past, because in the past they were different with like the patriarchal notions too. But I think
indeed, yeah.
it would really, yeah, perhaps, speak in ethical terms, do a service if people understood love more in this Badiouian sense.
I think
It's
it would bring more happiness into the world
I
too. That
completely
if
agree.
people,
Completely agree.
yeah, yeah. I mean, romantic love, which is sort of the big dominant model, that says that basically that you've got to be like the other, there's got to be a fusion, right? And that when there's difference, it's a problem. And what can that? Of course, there's going to be
Yeah,
difference. Difference is the nature of things,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
Difference is everywhere. So, of course, that leads to unhappiness. The other model that Badiou is very critical of, and which is closer to the more commodity version that you're talking about, is really familial love in the sense of, a couple and a child, right? The production of a child as a kind of a proof of love, as a sort of like the only way that you know that love is real, that he's very critical of. He's not critical of marriage or people having children, but that this would be sort of the definitive model of love. And both of those models have had huge histories and unfortunately are still infecting, many people and making people very unhappy. So yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And I've got 2 points on this. In fact, I mean, I'd love to just, this is a beautiful topic to discuss. The first one is, it's funny, I was having a discussion with my partner just a few days ago. And I was telling her, I don't like this notion, especially men, they say this, they say, oh, she's the mother of my children. I would like I don't have children, but if I do have children in the future, I'd always refer to my partner as my partner. I mean, and after that, the mother of my children. Because, I mean, firstly, my partner isn't a baby making machine, but also the purpose of our relationship isn't, to produce babies. So I always found
Right.
that notion a bit problematic. And the second thing, okay, now again, to be a bit provocative, now that we're here. I've heard criticisms of Badiou and even Žižek, as a matter of fact, that they're, what's the term like, phallogocentric or, heteronormative because they defend monogamy. And because I'm curious to hear, there are other forms of love. I'm speaking here of eros, romantic love, of course, there's familial, all of that too, but just within romantic love. How would Badu, speak of the other forms like, what's it called, polyamory or open relationships or whatnot? And then I feel like he still defends monogamy because of the singularity aspect. What are your thoughts on that, Professor?
Yeah. Well, I think that I wouldn't say exactly monogamy because maybe serial monogamy is something that that perhaps Zizek certainly and Badiou to some extent too might support. But I think you're right that there is a kind of a lurking heteronormative aspect in Badiou's thinking. And let's face it, I mean, despite protests and developments in the thinking, there is in Lacan's thinking too, that there is a certain assumption of a kind of a radical difference between men and women that will be the constitutive of, you know, of the possibility for love. For Lacan, the possibility of love is still questionable whether it's anything more than a kind of an illusion or a sort of a narcissistic mistake we make. But whatever counts as love is going to be based on the non-sexual encounter between a man and a woman, right? Now, what a man and a woman mean for Lacan is, of course, not biological. They're not
Symbol.
talking about biological, they talk about subjective structures, right? And I think that Badiou's account, like Lacan's, um, even if Badiou would not say there's no such thing as a sexual relationship, he's like, that's ridiculous, Certainly there are sexual relationships. But if he thinks that there's a kind of a heteronomy, a kind of a real different, radical difference that is constitutive of the love relationship, right? That it does tend to often assume the form of a man and woman in his thinking, in his examples. Let's put it that way. So my sense is that there's a kind of almost a kind of a cultural heteronormativity that a man of his generation assumes, takes on, that he's not woke in that sense, for whatever we make of that expression. But I don't think it's a radical principle by any means, and he's by no means resistant to all sorts of different configurations of love in practice. I think that the theory tends to be male and female because that's the clearest account of real difference for him. But of course, he thinks that two men or two women or, trans people, they can also have an experience of love, which is based on a radical encounter with difference and all of the possibilities that love that emerge. So I wouldn't take that critique too far. I think it's more sort of like, well, for his generation, that's not surprising. But it's not a conceptual or even an ideological sort of perspective. It's where his examples come from, right? And they're
Yeah.
not meant to be
Yeah.
defensive.
And I mean, also like metaphysically, the notion is the disjuncture and difference. Yes, at least from what I've experienced, monogamy is where I've seen that disjuncture between a man and a woman, or even two men, but two men are different, two women, it doesn't really matter, two subjects, let's say. However, theoretically, you could still have it in a relationship beyond two people, I assume. Yeah, but I guess
Yeah, I think
one,
so.
yeah, one
Yeah.
thing I appreciate again about Badiou and even Žižek for that matter is that they're not moralists. There's no moralism here, none of that.
Yeah.
So we could kind of speak of that. Excellent, beautiful. Okay, thank you so much for humoring me with that, Professor. That was great.
Oh no, I love talking about Badiou on love.
It's
I
just
agree with you. It's
yeah.
one of the most kind of satisfying and communicable aspects of his thinking.
I completely agree. Yeah, it's again to kind of reiterate my previous point, even for someone who has no interest in philosophy or ontology or
Yeah,
metaphysics, this topic I
yeah,
think resonates as
yeah.
something.
And let's face it, the bar is pretty high for a lot of, entry into Badiou's thinking for a lot of his work.
Yeah,
It's high, there's no question. But love is a wonderful exception to that.
I agree. I mean, I thought what being an event what 4 years ago. Now I'm still reading it. It's just one of those
It's
books
a, it's a
I've
very
wrote
difficult book.
for a lifetime.
It's a
Yeah,
wonderful book and it's worth
beautiful.
close reading. It's helpful to read it in a group. I really think reading with other people is very, very helpful. But it's hard. There's no question. And for many people, mathematics is a real problem. Badiou's account of mathematics is that it's really the most clear, transparent possible language, right? It's the opposite of difficult, that it has everything pure and straightforward about it. But nevertheless, for many people, it's not the case at all. And we experience math as maybe a little traumatic even, right? So this is unfortunate. And I do hope to help people experience the math also intuitively as something that you don't simply have an abstract conception of, but you can make new sense out of if you think about it, and have good teachers, which I've been fortunate to have.
No doubt, no doubt. I mean, it's funny you say that because I listened to a lecture by Badiou. I think it was called Philosophy and Mathematics or something, and he makes this bit of a tongue-in-cheek comment that, mathematics, it's problematic not because it's too difficult, but because it's too simple. And what he meant by that was this notion that, yeah, it's very straightforward in the if you can get it, you get it. Like there's no ambiguity in the mathematical
Yeah,
symbolism or the signifiers. So there's something there.
yeah,
Uh, all right. I feel like we did touch on this in our conversation at certain points, but I kind of do want to just have like a segment of the episode just on the notion of Badiou and truth. So you start in the introduction to Beginning in Volume 3, Imminence of Truths. You say at the heart of Alain Badiou's philosophical work since the 1980s has been the project of reconceiving and reclaiming a concept of truth. So, yes, Professor, what does that mean? What is this project that Alan Badiou is involved in and Badiouians, I assume?
yeah, yeah. Again, truth is one of those words that goes in and out of fashion, right? We tended to be skeptical of truth in the 90s and the beginning of the 21st century, we tended to see it as ideology, as somebody's truth, a particular truth that's masquerading as the universal, right? And then in very harrowing and depressing Trump era, truth has once again become a very important value when misinformation and just delusion seem to be spreading so easily. People have really once again sort of said, well, we do need truth. We need some sense of what truth is. But the problem is that we don't really have a good account of truth. Truth is a concept that tends to easily dissolve into all the various, let's say, fields in which it becomes objectionable. It becomes easily ideology. It becomes somebody's truth. It becomes an opinion that has become a popularized opinion and then gains currency, right? Truth is easily manipulated and distorted when we understand it as correspondence, right? And this all again goes back to Aristotle. Aristotle really, if not invented, he codified the idea that truth means the correspondence between a representation and something in the world or an idea, right? So you have a kind of notion of adequacy. Is this notion, this concept, this word, this representation adequate? Does it get at, right? Does it represent the thing out there well enough? Does it get at its particularity, we might say? And that became our benchmark of truth. And for Aristotle, it's very much a critique of Plato to present truth in those terms, right? And that's a long discussion. We don't really need to get into that now. But the notion of truth as a kind of an accurate, reliable representation of reality, became dominant. And one should not dismiss this by any means. The question is, how do we understand it? Do we understand what Badiou will call not truth, but veridicality, right? If there's a kind of an accuracy of representation, which we certainly do need to value, we should not by any means minimize. And we know more and more in our contemporary world that it's a precious commodity. The knowledge, and really this is where knowledge and truth become opposed, the knowledge of how representations of things connect or don't connect to things in the world, right? That's a very important part of our human existence. And knowledge in that sense is how we construct what Badiou calls, in Being an Event, the encyclopedia that we live in. Every situation, whether we're talking about, a political situation, an artistic world, a scientific world, whatever situation we're talking about, it has the terms that Badiou calls an encyclopedia that define its parameters, that establish what counts as an acceptable representation of knowledge and what is excluded, right? What is recognizable as knowledge and truth in the limited sense of truth, and what is repudiated is not significant, right? So a world gets established where there's certain ways of seeing things. This counts, in a certain, it's a very structuralist account, you might say, very semiotic, where, when you are in most of the world, not all the world, most of the world, and you see a red light when you're driving, it means stop, right? When you see a green light, it means go, right? That's an established kind of a parameter that defines the universe of the rules of the road, right? So to work in that world well, you have to obey that basic established set of conventions. When you're in a classroom, there are similar conventions, right? We know there are social conventions that say you don't, run screaming to the front of the room and tear up the professor's book, right? That's not considered legitimate. And there are other, things that are recognizable, considered legitimate activities, right? There's a discourse, you might say, in more Lacanian terms, the discourse of the university in that case, that establishes the parameters of knowledge and of facts. And this is, again, not to be dismissed by any means or minimized in terms of its value. But what it prohibits, the problem with it is that it doesn't allow us to see something really new, right? Like if you've read that wonderful book Flatland, kind of a mathematical fantasy about what it means if you're in a two-dimensional world, right? A world which is just a plane, and a three-dimensional creature enters into that world, right? Well, you can't see it as a three-dimensional creature. You would see it if it was a sphere. You would see it as a point that would slowly become a circle that would expand and then contract again to a point as it passed through the plane that we live on, right? So it's fundamentally not available to you to know what a sphere is in that world. Even if a sphere is a real thing, right? It's not available to that two-dimensional world. Now, the same thing happens with every sphere of knowledge where we have an established encyclopedia. We have all the facts and we're able to judge new things that come in terms of the pre-existing knowledge and encyclopedia, the kind of like tables of what count and what are excluded, right? All that is available to us. But if something really new comes about, we don't have the vocabulary for it. We don't have the knowledge for it. And this is precisely the possibility, not yet a truth, but the possibility of a truth for Badiou, right? If he calls it an event, right, the event will have a site, a locus, a specific point in which it emerges in a particular situation or world. When I use those words interchangeably, a world is merely Badiou's later sense of a situation that includes not only ontology, right, but phenomenology, how things appear in a world, as well as how they are constituted ontologically. So in a situation or in a world, when something truly new emerges, it's not parsable in terms of the encyclopedia. This is the possibility of a truth. And it's only a possibility, right? It takes something. And this is when the subject really emerges in Badiou, because truth and the subject are intimately connected. Any individual, an individual is, if you will, a pre-subject or a not yet subject for Badiou. Any individual has the possibility of looking at that thing and saying, whoa, something just happened. What the hell was that? And if they decide that it in fact was something that matters to them existentially, right? Not just in some abstract way, and that makes them want to go ahead and find what else might be connected with that happening, right? Whether it's, again, a political event or some innovation in science, something completely new emerges in that world. And then in that world of knowledge, we have a gap, right? And this is where Badiou says that truth establishes a hole in knowledge, right? Lacan will say the same thing. Heidegger will say the same thing. Even, Plato and to some extent Hegel will say something similar, right? That truth emerges precisely where knowledge fails, where something in knowledge no longer is adequate to this new, something, this upsurging something imminent to that world, but never before available, never before seen. So at that moment, that decompletion of that world, that encyclopedia, allows the possibility for a subject to emerge. Because the subject, what Badiou calls a subject, is simply the local instantiation of the process of tracing the implications of that event and establishing that what we talked about earlier as a generic set of all the other things that it randomly encounters in its world that seem to be connected with that event, that seem to corroborate it in some way, that seem, maybe not in any obvious way, but in interesting new ways to be continuities with that event. And so you get this growing new part, this new part of the situation, where that hole in the knowledge of the situation first emerged, that we as subjects, we who declare ourselves faithful to that event, who say that event mattered and it mattered to me, and I'm going to really spend some time figuring out why, what happened, and what are its implications, right? That allows for the production of a truth. And that truth is going to be something that was not seen before in that world, was not available to the knowledge in the world. It's not new things that are coming into the world, but it's a new part of a world. It's new connections among the actual things in the world. And Badiou will talk about the things in the world as bodies and languages, right? The things in the world, the elements in the world there can be broken down into those two, types. There are the elements, the physical bodies, and then there are the languages, the way in which those bodies are codified, distributed, given meaning, right? So when in fact a truth emerges and is starting to be built, it comes in addition to the totality of the pre-existing world, the totality of bodies and languages in that world. It's a kind of an internal supplement, a new part of the world that's using those same elements, but arranging them in unheard of ways,
And
new
that's the
ways.
imminence, right? That's the imminent part of it.
That's imminent. And that's what for Badiou is the proletariat, right? The proletariat is not a particular class of workers or people who are disenfranchised, who own nothing, but the proletariat is that imminent group that emerges precisely in that way in politics, if you will.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, that was a really good connection there. I love that you made the connection. Yeah, because I feel like this kind of the disenfranchised, I don't know, migrants, refugees, whatever, that's a more of a liberal way of viewing the so-called working class or whatnot. That was great. Thank you, Professor. Okay, just a slight segue here, or perhaps a tangential question, would be you mentioned the term event. I've read in multiple places or even heard people talk about the fact that for Badiou, 9/11 was not an event. So just
yes.
the concrete example to further perhaps elucidate this, why wasn't 9/11 an event for Badiou?
Yeah, it's a good question, and you can expand that to why, provocatively he'll ask why the Holocaust was not an event. What is an event? An event in that sense is something that we really do need to specify, right? Because it's not just something unheard of that's happening, something that occurs for which there is no precedent, that's not recognizable. It's precisely, there are certain parameters that it has to have in terms of the kind of, what emerges out of it, right? And those, first of all, involve universality, right? You can't have an event that is only an event for some people, or is an event that, by definition excludes some people, right? An event is got to be completely open to everyone. There's an egalitarianism at the heart of Badiou's thinking, which is utterly crucial. So if we think of, something like 9/11, it was, it was an event in a kind of an intuitive sense of the word. It disrupted the world. It was, it was in some ways an upsurge of something that was unrecognizable heretofore, right? But the question finally is, and it's only in retrospect that you can judge whether an event was an event or not, is did it lead to universalist possibilities? Did what emerged from it construct new truths? And a truth is, again, egalitarian, universal, infinite, and absolute. And you could simply, you can simply say that there's what he'll call a pseudo event when we're talking about 9/11, when we're talking about the Holocaust, when we're talking about disasters. That's another way of talking about it. Disasters of various sorts are terrible and can have incredible implications. Sometimes even positive ones can come out of them, right? But unless they're truly universal, let's say there's an event, let's not go to such extreme examples, but something more local, right? If there is an event that somehow changes the conditions of existence of a particular group of people, that something happens and the whether we're talking about a class of people or a race or ethnicity, whatever, that it allows them to really just kind of improve their quality of life, if you will, to change things in a way that would be clearly beneficial, obviously positive. It doesn't count as an event for Badiou if it doesn't have truly universal implications, meaning if it can't be extended beyond that identity group, all right? There's a real resistance to identity politics in Badiou's thinking. He
Yeah.
really doesn't understand struggle as a struggle for individual group rights. He sees the struggle as always a collective struggle, always for universal rights or universal freedoms, right? For equality. Equality is the overwhelming, right, sort of, if you will, ethical principle in Badiou's thinking, much more so than liberty, right, would be. I think he's very suspicious of, the way that freedom, liberty get used. But equality is a kind of a radical bottom line for him. And if something prefers one group of people in any way, there's a problem, you know.
Yes, yes.
Uh,
I should just mention a bit of a point here. Another thinker who's deeply influenced me, contemporary thinker, uh, Todd McGovern. He wrote a book called Emancipation After Hegel, but also he's mentioned it in a couple of his talks. This idea is that if you're a true leftist, you have to be a universalist. You can't. The particularism or being a particularist is inherently a right-wing ideology because it's about so identity politics for him would be, without a doubt, a right wing. It's sort of a rightist way of viewing things, because again, it's particular groups, be it race, gender, whatnot. So, and it's again, this is the point we were discussing at the outset. This universalism that I'm deeply attracted to in Badiou, in this Slovenian school, and even Hegel. And I think really, I would even argue now, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on a more of a contemporary political discussion, Professor, like with the re-election of Trump and how really the so-called populist movement has been taken over by uh, right-wingers and reactionaries. I really think the left needs to just jettison any kind of particularist politics or identitarianism, because I really don't see it going anywhere, in my humble opinion.
I completely agree with you, and I completely agree with Todd, by the way, who's a good friend of mine. Yeah, this is an important point, but I do think there's something we have to kind of something that complicates this a little bit. There is the possibility, and Slavoj will talk about this, a lot of people will talk about this, of sublating a particularity to a universal, right? That the particular universal is not a kind of a radical opposition,
Correct. It's
right?
dialectical. Yeah.
Something concrete for Hegel, right, is precisely some particular element that has been given universal value. So this means that a particular struggle, an individual struggle, doesn't need to remain an identitarian, kind of, localized, specific sort of problem. It can elevate itself to a universal struggle, a universal cause. And I think that that's really important, that the universal doesn't come from the top down. I mean, for Hegel in particular. And I think that Badiou and the Slovenians will agree with this, that it really involves the making concrete of something particular. Something particular can gain universal value. And so an event is always something particular, right? It happens in a situation. It's historically specific in every way, right? And then the project of tracing its implications, of creating that new generic set, is really the process of universalizing it, right? Of sublating it to the universal in Hegelian terms.
Indeed.
So I agree though that our immediate problem is identitarianism, though, that becomes a kind of a sort of unfortunately, it's been, I think, the death of the left or the progressive movement, however you want to put it,
I concur.
right? That we need to get away from that and find a way to sublate these particularities to a more common universal struggle.
Yeah, I mean,
Otherwise, we're lost.
I would just say that as an Australian, just you know, uh, leaving aside theory for a moment, it's even existentially, it's exhausting, it's boring, it's vapid, identity politics, and you feel like you kind of get stuck. And so yeah, the left. Anyway, it's a whole other can of worms to open up there. All right, Professor, just the this is a last, hopefully fun question. I'm just curious. I feel like you're the
You've all
best.
been fun.
Yeah. Oh, great. Oh, that's the best. That's the best thing I could hear from you. Thank you. Thank you. I would say so. I mean, I think you're the best person to ask this question, given you've written a book with Žižek, the neighbor. You wrote that book. And then you've done all
With
this.
Eric Santner too.
Yes. Sorry, I should mention that too. Um, I'll leave a link. I'll put an overlay to the book while we're discussing it for the not the listeners, in this case the viewers. And then you've done all this work on Badiou. So yeah, one last fun question. What in your view are the big differences between Badiou and Žižek?
Well, that's a can of worms. But actually, in the seminar that my translation partner Susan and I are working on now on Plato, it's quite interesting. As you said, it's like a 900-page seminar. It extends over 3 years. And twice Slavoj comes in and is a guest speaker in the seminar. And one of the sessions, the whole session is really devoted to what are the similarities and the differences between our thinking. And so it's a quite involved discussion. But one thing that I think is very, quick and clear to distinguish them, and I think that they're really on the same page in many, many ways. But one thing that does distinguish them is this Lacanian and Freudian notion of the death drive, right? Death is really something quite different for the two of them. As a good Lacanian, Slavoj, it gives a primacy to the notion of the death drive and repetition. Of course, it's what keeps us, from happiness. It's what forces us to repeat our symptoms, to cling to our pain and all that. And he has very good reason to make those arguments, as psychoanalysis does, that just look around at the kind of terrible pain that we see, the self-destructiveness, self-generated, repetitive, kind of pain. And how can we understand this otherwise? For Badiou, it's not the case at all. There is no death drive. I mean, maybe, on a certain psychological level, he would agree that there is a kind of a radicality of the pleasure principle, which means, in almost technical Freudian terms, the tendency to evacuate all tension, to return to zero. But in real terms, Badiou doesn't really believe in death. Death does not mean to Alain what it means to the psychoanalytic world, or for that matter, Heidegger, right? As something which is a fundamental condition of life, a limitation, right, which is immanent within us, which is always conditioning our experiences, whether that means our repetitive experiences, our failures to achieve happiness, all the various things that we suffer from. For Badiou, death is simply something that happens. It's something that happens from the outside. It's not intrinsic to the human subject. It's intrinsic, of course, to the human being. The human individual dies. There's no question about that. But in much more profoundly important terms, Badiou wants to insist that we do have the possibility, all of us, of being immortal. That there's a real immortality in a truth procedure, in becoming the subject of a truth procedure, in joining the collective work of a truth procedure. We are really gaining an immediate universality and eternity, right? There's something, that resists death, absolutely, that doesn't know death in Badiou's notion of a truth procedure. Truth procedures may have their periodizations, they may come and go, but they're eternal. They can always come back again. They can always resurface and be developed and expanded in new ways. So death is not, by any means a limitation for Badiou or a condition that determines our experience of life. And that, I think, is the biggest difference between him and Slavoj.
Perfect. Yes. I mean, I think you're right. The Slavoj and the Slovenian school, they do very much, for them, the death drive it's ontological, really. It's like this almost
Yes.
drive, even independent in some sense to the subject that keeps going. It's like a brute on fact of the universe in some sense. Yeah,
Yes.
great. But that was really important. I'm glad that you fleshed that out. Especially, I did have a question on psychoanalysis, and I think you really, really connected it beautifully to all the other discussions we've been having so far. Yeah, this was great, Professor. This has been very soul edifying, if I may say. Yeah, I mean, you did touch on this at the outset, yes, but if you could just, for the listeners, apart from, yes, the 900-page seminar, what other projects are you working on at the moment, and what can we expect? What's in the pipeline, let's say?
Well, the next seminar that will come out, that Susan and I translated, which I'm very excited about, is on Parmenides, the early Greek thinker who Badiou has an amazing reading of. Truly, powerful, revisionary, quite extraordinary. So I think that's something to look forward to. It'll come out this spring. There's another book that will also come out this spring, which is just a wonderful, totally readable book, something along the lines, in some ways, of the book In Praise of Love. He has a book coming out, In Praise of Philosophy. And that is a dialogue. It's a Socratic dialogue. There is a kind of a Socrates/Badiou figure and a whole group of young people from all over the world, including Amantha, his addition to when he translated Plato's Republic, he introduced this woman character, Amantha, instead of a Diamantes, which is quite interesting. And this is just a lovely, lovely readable book. It's a play as much as anything else. It really could be staged. So I think that that's a terrific first book for people to read of Badiou's. And for people who are perhaps interested in Greek philosophy and mathematics, and really the relationship of philosophy and mathematics, the seminar on Parmenides is astonishing.
Beautiful, beautiful.
After that, I'm very much looking forward to the publication. The book is now complete. Bruno Bastiles, a great Badiouian scholar, has translated Badiou's seminar on Nietzsche, and that is absolutely amazing. That will be coming out after the Parmenides seminar. And I guess I could say that after Plato, which is going to take us a while still, it's so enormous. We are looking forward to finally getting to Badiou's Heidegger seminar. That is a personal favorite too.
Wow. Well, I
So
can say one thing for sure. Yourself and Susan, you both sure do have your hands full. Lot
me
going.
too.
Maybe, I mean, I don't know, we can talk about this offline because this did catch my eye on in the email you sent me. When it's out in Praise of Philosophy, I'd love to invite you and Susan again just to discuss the book in the future, if that's okay.
Sure. Yeah. I think
That,
it's, it's a wonderful book.
yeah, yeah.
Uh,
Right.
and yeah, yeah. Let's see if Susan would join us. I'm not sure she would, but she
Oh
might.
yeah, I mean, I'll
Uh,
extend the invite if she
yeah,
agrees to it. Yeah, great. Thank you.
yeah, yeah.